Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are on the planet, and welcome to the Schiller Institute International Conference. I'm Diane Sayre. I'll be moderating this panel. The conference is titled, All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to be Called Up. Mankind Must Be the Immortal Species. And we do have a second musical introduction to this panel, which is very special, this fourth panel being dedicated to the question of a truly human culture. And what we are going to be watching and listening to is a performance by the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus of the last movement of Beethoven's extraordinary choral work, the Missa Solemnis. This was a particular challenge because the chorus had chosen to embark on this exceedingly difficult masterwork during the year of the pandemic, as it turned out, and we had to learn our parts remotely and record remotely and put them together. But I think you'll find that an excellent job has been done. Let me just say that the last movement is the Agnus Dei, which means Lamb of God. Lamb of God, qui tollis peccata mundi, who takes away the sins of the world. Miserere nobis, have mercy on us. And then the second part, Dona nobis pacem, give us peace. And this work is about an hour and a half or so in length. It's magnificent. It is rather surprising that Beethoven ends it in a subdued and introspective way, and he puts a note at the beginning of the Dona nobis pacem section, prayer for inner and outer peace. So I hope you will hear that in this performance. Excellent. Very fitting way to begin this panel of the conference. All the moral resources of humanity have to be called up. Mankind must be the immortal species. And to start us off on the panel of the beauty of true human culture, we will have a dear friend of mine and colleague, Jacques Cheminade, who is the leader of the French party Solidarité et Progrès, and also a former presidential candidate of France and a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche. And he is going to be speaking to us about the Squid Game and other things to come.
Squid Game and other things to come. Ideas are what is required as a source for the increase of man's power over nature to generate an economic platform to increase our potential relative population density. Forming ideas based on principles and concentration of our creative capacities on such principles is what nourishes our power to discover. This is what defines our capacity to create a future, the capacity to survive as a species. If you destroy such power to generate ideas, you therefore destroy the future. It is precisely what's happening here and now, under permanent lightenings of raw, bestial emotions thrown through the screens of our digital equipments. Our adolescents and children are immersed in a universe combining hyper-violent video games, trash and gore, pornography, and TV series, particularly those of Netflix, conveying a world of virtual fantasies which destroys the concentration of our creative capacities. The flow of images targets the non-cognitive modes of fantasy life imagery, associating erotic compulsions to bestial violence. If we let this assault continue, the result will be no future. This is not just tricks of a counterculture controlled by commercial forces. It is a geopolitical intention to infantilize and bestialize through the hacking of our minds. It is a conscious policy of the Anglo-American oligarchy to transform citizens into subjects, sickening with an indifferent depravity to real crimes, and prone to willful submission to ruling powers, a transformation into impotent voyeurs of various Games of Thrones. Some of you may consider what I'm saying as a conspiratorial view. I'm going to start by showing you some relevant images and then going into the gist of a crucial paper written by LaRouche on December 1997, The Wells of Doom, urging us not to cling to the sinking ship of an evil open conspiracy set by H.G. Wells himself as the lackey of the British oligarchy. This is the Queen of England visiting the set of a TV series called Games of Thrones in the British province of Ulster, a series which has been followed by billions of human beings all over the world as an addictive drug mixing fantasy, sex, violence, and lust for power. The Queen advances trotting, ahead of Prince Philip, who had sadistically tested with his fingers the sharpness of a panoply of various pseudo-medieval weapons. The Queen then reaches the Iron Throne made of swords belonging to defeated landlords, and the actors of the series propose her to sit on the throne. She answers bluntly no, because she obviously believes that her own throne gives her more power. Why then the Queen of England would visit the set of Games of Thrones and greet the crew? The Queen of England checking the actors of a TV series? Well, there we have an illustration of the not-so-soft power of a monarchy examining with a perverse indifference one of the main weapons of her ideological power, playing with the infantile bestialization of our emotions. Now let's reach a temporary step forward, Squid Game. Temporary because other things will come if we let things proceed as they are. There you have a series of 9 episodes. Games of Thrones had almost 100. Launched by Netflix on September 17th, and also viewed by billions of human beings all over the world like Games of Thrones. Squid Game is a crude image of a world ruled by perverse assassins who organize a competition where all the losers are going to be killed, the only one who will survive being the winner of a fortune of 45.6 billion wons. The series is South Korean, about $39 billion. Of course, The level of carnage and slaughter displayed is not something new. The survival stories, such as Hunger Games, or the manga types such as Battle Royale, Darwin's Game, Alice in the Borderland, and many others, have already been viciously spread around. As I'm going to explain you later, there is a thread between the perverse fantasies of post-World War I, promoted by H.G. Wells and others, the 1964-1972 mass brainwashing of university campus baby boomers, and the present step ahead into a worse quality of hatred and manipulation of fear. What is new with Squid Game is therefore not the technological shock of the images, moderately sophisticated, as cynical gamers would say, but what's key is the social content. The participants of the game are over-indebted leftovers, varieties of undermention, who have lost everything through the gambling of their lives in the real world. The killer games are viciously derived from children's games, like the Squid Game, a sort of Asian hopscotch. The participants shall run towards an area of safety, and if they move at the wrong moment, they are unmercifully killed. Let's have an image of the game.
3, soleil.
Comme le jeu auquel on jouait quand on était gamin.
Guess what? In a lot of European school playgrounds, kids are already playing this game, not of course killing the loser, but in many cases beating him up or lashing at it. Besides, at this point, there are already big puppets of the game in various Asian countries. What is then really new with this game? The combination of desperate, over-indebted praise coming to play with a full democratic consent. After the first mass killing, they all vote either to stay in the game or to leave. And once a majority votes to stop the game, most of them come back after because, as one character says, outside, anyway, we live like animals. And finally, they are all killed except the winner. After all, are put in situations, in the meantime, to betray their best friends in a 21st century version of a concentration camp. The whole game is set for a group of VIPs, degenerated orgiastic oligarchs who take their pleasure in following the game killers, the killer games. The winner is at the end anguished by guilty feelings and give all his money to the mother and daughter of one of the victims, and the series ends like a snake biting its tail. The creators of the piece present their intention as a critique of the murderous behavior of the oligarchical ruling class. But if you compare it to Shakespeare, it is not a challenge to change one's behavior, but a set of repetitive perceptions creating an addictive confusion into our minds. With Squid Game, you are emotionally trapped into a setup without any capacity of self-reflection. You are immersed into the game, wearing the shackles of a culture of death. I have called my presentation Squid Game and Other Things to Come, as a reference to H.G. Wells, to look at Squid Game not only as a series, but at the extreme present moment of a universe thrown against us. Things to come after, if we don't intervene, is doomed to be a universal fascism imposed through, in part, induced consent. Because the policy of the oligarchical power is to rule by fear and chaos, and engineering of perception based, as a French contemporary anonymous author calls, management sciences. It is a nebula of disciplines that began to constitute a coherent corpus from the 1920s onward, and whose information theory and cybernetics summarize the main ideological lines. Namely, living beings and conscious objects are information systems that can be controlled, modeled, and even hacked in the same way as non-living information systems composed of non-conscious objects. It is aimed at human life itself, because the essence of human life is to escape to any control and create. Therefore, to reduce it to a set of predictable behaviors means to kill it, the monster generated by the dreams of reason. Back to H.G. Wells. He wrote The Shape of Things to Come as a science fiction dystopia in 1933, 2 years after Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. In both works, a war leaves the world in ruins, a self-appointed elite takes over to rebuild it, and engages in social engineering to refashion human society. In Wells' conception, the Second World War takes place, a war fought between countries on the verge of economic collapse. It remembers you something. With both sides launching air bombings at each other's main cities. Governments break down, industries and urban centers are destroyed, and a strange and terrible pestilence, a wandering sickness spreading through the world, kills a large part of humanity in 1956 and 1957. Civilization nearly ends, but a benevolent dictatorship of an advanced Air Force elite fortunately takes over, abolishing organized religions and abolishing nation states. We don't approve independent sovereign states, declares one of the heroes, of the so-called heroes, to establish a modern global world state. After around 100 years, the dictatorship of the air is overthrown in a bloodless coup, and a society of English-speaking polymath emerges, each equal to the great geniuses of the past, while the two honorably retired leaders of the benevolent dictatorship comment as Hamlets from the future, "No rest, no ending for men, all the universe for nothing, animals, men mattering no more than other little animals." A movie was produced in 1936 as a mass promotion of Wells' fantasies. Let's see a picture of Wells and the airplanes of the elite, a 1930s version of Star Wars.
Look! Is that gas? You won't get out of this. You!
Don't you see we're beaten?
Shoot them! What are you all doing?
Lyndon LaRouche, looking at the state of the world in 1997, examines the wells of doom to give us the leads to get rid of the nightmare becoming true. The fact, as Squid Games gives us a sense today, that the situation is much worse now than it was in 1997, makes the message of LaRouche even more urgent to assimilate, to purge ourselves of the ruling Western counterculture. All these dystopic, harebrained ideas have a point in common: Malthusianism, the debasing of the value of human life within a system of rules which acknowledge no principle. In Wells' movie, the benevolent dictators don't hesitate to gas the rebel populations, described as so backward that no other choice was left to the elite. For ruling over them, Wells gives his recipe. In a world where pressure on the means of subsistence was a normal condition of life, it was necessary to compensate for the removal of traditional sexual restraints, And so my advocacy of simple and easy love-making had to be supplemented by an adhesion to the propaganda of the neo-Malthusians. It is our present counterculture of the population, already in the words of H.G. Wells, and, as John Maynard Keynes said, peppered with sex and statistics. Our task is therefore to apply the Socratic method to smoke out the hidden perverse assumptions underlying our beliefs and to reestablish the basis for our true culture of life, serve for happiness, not pleasures and discovery. According to the words of Lyndon LaRouche, thus today the near obliteration of classic artistic culture from the US population, I add, and from the whole Western world, and its replacement by the most debased expressions of Dionysiac revels is a major internal security threat to the continued existence of our republic. Against the deprived indifference to principle, LaRouche refers to the human quality of agape, expressed as a passion for truth and justice, natural law being the impact of an efficiently served agapic passion for men as being made in the cognitive image of God, the opposed to the common law principle of the oligarchy. Replace entertainment premised on erotic perceptions and each time more and more on a morbid fascination for death. With agape is thus required to stop this corrosive descent into destructive cultural pessimism that followed the years after World War I and, worse, in our present times of wars against the weak and the poor, conducted with the induced pervasive and depraved indifference of the populations. Agape is what leads the capacity of the human mind to generate discoveries of new validated principles and to transmit the discoveries to other minds. This latter characteristic, stresses LaRouche, correlates with anti-entropy. More profoundly, he says, it is this same human cognitive anti-entropy which defines the anti-entropic relationship of the human species to the universe at large. The suppression of agape, as by eliminating the factor of classical art, results in a form of escapism into synthetic virtual realities, converging on an erotically motivated forms of moral and intellectual degeneracy. This is LaRouche in 1997. There is a battlefield for our minds, and the reason why I wanted to start with Games of Thrones and Squid Game, not as things in themselves, but as evidences of an evil culture that we shall once and for all throw to the river without return. I am optimistic about the success of our fight. Very optimistic, because creative and moral potentials are the essence of our species. Second, because soon people are going to be convinced by the living conditions and the future of their children and the state of mind of their children that there is no other way to go than to change. In China, the access to video games for children has already been restricted at most to 1 hour per day on holidays only, and the content of series is under control to eradicate pornography and bloody scenarios. I was recently happily surprised to read in the Sunday supplement of Féminin Hebdo, a French magazine usually promoting silly things for women, an article on the influence of the series. It says, I quote, that they are produced with colossal means of financing and based on the neurosciences. Everything is done to mobilize our brain non-stop. Visual and audition stimuli, emotional extremes, narrative mechanisms. The scenario provides a very strong emotion, but when the episode ends, the emotion dissipates. Everything then goes down. It is like a mini depression. To get back another dose of pleasure, we follow up with the next one. We can measure the danger, says the author. It is easy for the Sayres to impose upon us their way to see the world. Besides, they are mobilized as a weapon of geopolitical influence. End of the quote. When such a diagnosis is usefully formulated in such an unsuspected place, there is plenty of room for hope, provided that we go deeper and deeper, not only into our resistance, but much more into providing the moral, economic, and social ways to rebuild an anti-entropic, happy world out of the screens of our present cave.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Before we go on to our next speaker, and let me just say there's a slight change in the ordering of our program today. Mr. Zhu Huang will be speaking a little bit later, and we will next be joined by Professor Wahab. But let me just urge everybody who is watching, and for people who were not with us at the beginning, this is the fourth panel of the Schiller Institute International Conference entitled All the Moral Resources of Humanity Must Be Called Up. Mankind has to be the immortal species. Please join the Schiller Institute. One thing we do not have is too many leaders. We need more leaders and more people who are informed of the great issues facing mankind today, who are not going to succumb to the low-level thinking about great strategic crises and opportunity that we're subjected to in the social media. And also, if you join the Schiller Institute and make a minimal monthly donation or donate to become a member, you will receive in your email a newly started publication called Lenora magazine, after Lenora in the Beethoven opera Fidelio. And we've only had one issue so far, so you'll be getting right in time to get the second issue, and hopefully all of them to come. So now let me turn to Professor Wahab, who is a professor emeritus of education from Lewis and Clark College in Oregon, but also a former advisor to the Afghanistan Minister of Higher Education.
Greetings from Portland, Oregon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas and concerns about my adopted country, the United States, and my country of origin, Afghanistan. And I'd like to focus on their education systems and also outline for you toward the end an ideal education system, which I think is highly needed and also would help us solve some of these problems. Now, the United States of America is suffering from some severe crises. We have enormous inequalities, economic, social, political, cultural, educational, and other kinds of extremes and inequalities. We're suffering from racism, sexism, and classism in society. There is sectarianism in our landscape. There are multiple culture wars underway in the country. There are ideological battles taking place between different groups and movements. There's political polarization such that I have not seen before. Society is becoming, or segments of society becoming, highly irrational, anti-scientific, and anti-evidence, but feeling and reacting and making policy based on subjectivities. Our infrastructure is collapsing. People, animals, and nature are being exploited to extreme. We have a runaway military, industrial, congressional complex which runs the country the way it wants. Our democracy is indeed imperiled, and we're facing an ecological catastrophe. Our institutions, from family to the Supreme Court, seem to be breaking down. And finally, there's a real threat of a nuclear war between the United States and its perceived or real adversaries. And the education system is largely dysfunctional and a disaster. I say so because I've visited and participated in the education systems of countries like India, China, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, Portugal, and Nicaragua. And of course, I have been a student and also an instructor in the education system, both in the United States and also in Afghanistan. So much for the United States. Now, my country of origin, as you might know, Afghanistan is the poorest and least developed country in Asia. Add to that the 4-decade plus wars, occupations, drought, and COVID. And these have combined to make the country almost unlivable. Everybody tells us that there's a massive famine underway as we speak, and the country is marching forward fast toward massive starvation. Many observers, from the Norwegian Refugee Center to the UN, have said that the country is the worst crisis in the world. Some have called it a hell on earth. And from what I know, just recently returning from Afghanistan, the country is in fact in a real existential crisis. It could disintegrate and fall apart. Its education system is currently non-existent. There are no organized schools or education that are really functioning. Before that, and even now to some extent, the quantity of education was very limited. The education system was imported from Europe and other countries. It is archaic, it's mechanical, it's abstract, it's substandard, it's irrelevant to the needs and desires and realities of Afghanistan and the learners, and the system is almost disruptive of the economy, polity, culture, society of Afghanistan. Education has always been a very low priority at the individual, family, or national level. Schools have no buildings. There's a teacher shortage, and the teachers who do exist are underqualified. There are very few to no resources, and there's very little support for the education system. And even as they are, the education system in the United States and in Afghanistan are essentially not only not a solution to our serious existential crises, but the education system itself has become a social problem for both countries, and I would say throughout the world. So there's a real need for a different kind of education system that would educate, train, and equip a different kind of human being for a different world order. That proposed education, I think, should be holistic. That is to say, the education system must address and develop the cognitive, affective, psychological, and physical aspects of the learner or the student. the school must merge with society. We must do away with the dichotomy between being a student and then being a human being or a citizen, between a learner and a doer. These need to merge, and as John Dewey reminded us, the school should be like a micro society. And teaching and learning must take place, as Vygotsky tells us, by doing and watching, what is called social learning and learning by doing. The education system must liberate individuals, collectives, and groups in society, and not serve as an instrument of domination. Both countries in the world, I would say, must follow the progressivist philosophy that John Dewey was known for. The education system must be interdisciplinary, the disciplines must be integrated, and they must be based on problem solving. In other words, the education system, as Paulo Freire would say, must pose problems and then help students to solve those problems. The education system must be humanistic, placing human beings and human existence in society at the center of the inquiry in teaching and learning. The education system must be organic, must be authentic, must be integrated, and must combine theory with practice. And at the end, the education system must provide full support for the full development of all of the human capacities and intelligences, what John Gardner told us are the 13 or so intelligences and aptitudes. It's only after these educational systems, in applying those, that the two countries can solve their serious problems and then be a model to emulate for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wahab. I would like to also let people know that you can submit questions at questions@schillerinstitute.org, and we welcome them, and they will be brought up later. Also, Professor Wahab had a few things he wanted to say about the situation in Afghanistan, which will be taken up also in the Q&A. Next, we are going to go to an educator, retired educator, Denise Rainey, who is a retired school principal, teacher, and administrator who had the great privilege to actually visit China. And she is going to share her reflections on that trip, coming as an American educator to see how things were done there.
My name is Denise Rainey. I am a retired educator in upstate New York. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years and a school administrator for 20 years in an urban district. And prior to retiring, I had the good fortune to be chosen by an organization called the China Exchange Initiative to be one of 30 American school principals to visit China in a cohort at the invitation and courtesy of the Chinese government. While there, we visited a number of Chinese schools at the elementary and high school levels, and we had previously been paired with Chinese principals who had come to visit us and our schools in the fall. And in the spring, when we went to China, we repaired with our matched principals and spent more time in their schools than in our broader tour of schools. While there, we met with local ministers of education to discuss comparisons between Chinese education, or what we observed, and the American system. Chinese educators were most interested in talking to us about how to increase the teaching, so to speak, of creativity, and in comparing what our suggestions would be for their systems. The Chinese school day is similar to ours in some small ways, but in broader ways, noticeably different, starting with arrival in the morning. Every school is a neighborhood school. So all students live within walking distance of their school, and they are escorted in the morning and to school, and in the afternoon, evening from school by a family member. So on arrival, we would see the families lined up waiting to come in. And when the gate opened, there was a very orderly entrance and orderly dismissal of students, with either parents or grandparents seeing them off or waiting to receive them to leave. There was a early start to the day and a late finish to the day. So the elementary days that I spent most time with typically ran from like 8 a.m. to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, with a 1.5 to 2 hour break in the afternoon when children left the school, went home, had a meal, maybe did some chores, maybe did some practice with their families, and came back for a round two, so to speak. So it was a very long day. When children were observed by their teachers to be struggling with something that was taught in the morning session, it was common. I saw several times where the teacher would wait to meet the parent or grandparent who came to pick the child up, and then say to them, you know, your child or your grandchild is struggling with this morning's content. And then instead of leaving for the 1.5 to 2 hour break, the parent or grandparent would go into the school with the child, and the teacher would do some reteaching immediately there with the family. And then the family would be expected to go home and through the evening and rest of the week work on the skill or the piece of academia that the student was struggling with at home. There's such a strong sense of family responsibility toward what the teachers are doing. I mean, frankly, if I saw an American teacher go out and say to a parent at the end of the school day, I need you to come back in because your child didn't understand what I was teaching, and I want to show you so that you can help them at school. Some parents would willingly come in and expect to be part of that, but some would say, no, I have things to do. I can't do this. I don't have the time now. What I observed was parent and grandparent just bowing, literally bowing in thanks to the teacher for taking their break time to do the reteaching, and every effort made to reinforce that teaching at home. And a true sense of responsibility that we're in this together, and you showed my child or my grandchild a skill or a technique or, you know, a protocol to be followed. They didn't understand it. Now we all have to pitch in together to make sure the child learns this. We kind of explored that, you know, how does this level of pride and ownership come about? And one of the things we learned, among many, was that in China, students clean the schools. And what I mean by that is every cluster of schools, every 2 or 3 or 4 facilities has a floating custodian who comes in to make any repairs or to do anything that an adult should do. But when it comes to sweeping the floors, washing the boards, mopping the floors, cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the cafeteria, students in the building are divided into teams. And Each team takes their week on rotation to clean the school. And they take that very seriously. And what I was told was that they get competitive with it. And if it's a particular team's turn this week to clean the school, they will literally give up their lunch period to do a recheck of all the bathrooms and a freshening up of the bathrooms. Or they'll go into the foyer where the leaves blew in during arrival and sweep that out. And they will come early and stay late to make sure that the school is spotless that entire week. That's their responsibility. And when we said, you know, do the parents object to this because the students are cleaning, or does anybody see this as an issue or as work that a paid adult should be doing? The response was overwhelming, like, no, you know, you don't do this in your schools. How do you teach your students responsibility? How do you teach them ownership and pride of where they are and what they have? Curriculum was amazingly encompassing in the schools that we visited in China. Very rigorous academic sessions, and we noticed some of the very strategies that we use, that we share with teachers in their professional development, just techniques to learn to check for student understanding. We do something at the elementary level that we call think, pair, share. The teacher may pose a problem or a question to be considered, and students are told to turn to a partner and think out loud with their partner about the question or the problem that was posed. And then after everyone's been given so many minutes to share with a partner, then they share out as a group, and each pair of students can say or contribute what they think might be a solution or the answer to the question or the problem. We saw a lot of that in Chinese classrooms. In addition to the academic classes, there were large rooms where other classes and subject areas were taught, and they ranged from traditional Chinese subjects such as calligraphy and traditional musical instruments to contemporary musical instruments. We saw violin instruction, piano instruction, the Chinese zither, and several other Chinese traditional instruments being taught in music class. Much of what we consider here to be extracurricular was part of the basic curriculum there. Every English-speaking adult that I could speak with and ask, you know, children here just seem so positive and so enthusiastic about what they're doing. And the response I would get was, we're a developing economy, and the Chinese have a very strong sense of optimism and excitement for their future. Students are going in every day feeling like they have a purpose, and they know that they're being educated to serve their nation in the future. So unlike here, where we might say to a 6 or 7 year old, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And, you know, and she might say a ballerina, or he might say a football player. Answers there would be more practically tied to the needs of the country. Well, we're building cities, and our country needs scientists, so I'm going to be a scientist, or I'm going to be an engineer, and I'm going to work on, you know, on big buildings, or I'm going to work on helping our medical system become better. When you went into the high schools, there was a very clear sense of purpose among high school students around what they were learning and the fact that they knew they were going to be applying this when they finally got out to the work world. So I think what struck us was the Chinese are very focused. They have a real sense of camaraderie. We're in this together. We're going to make this happen. We're going to make China a very strong economy and a strong international competitor. And we're going to make this nation the best that we can make it for each other. Sadly, I don't see that in U.S. schools. I think we may have had that in the 60s when the United States was competing with Russia. The United States was sort of jolted by Sputnik and an awareness that the Soviets were advancing scientifically faster than we were. And so during the John Kennedy era, there was a huge push for American schools to catch up with advancements in science and mathematics. And NASA kind of drove the American curriculum during that period. Right now, I don't see anything driving that sense for American students of we have something to accomplish, we have something to achieve, we need to become more competitive. I think, unfortunately, the American media too often says, oh, well, we're the strongest economy in the world. We have the best educational system in the world. We have the best university systems in the world. People who know that that is no longer true. None of those statements are accurate. And what's sad is that American students and the American school systems in general don't have a sense of what we're striving for to achieve as a nation.
Thank you very much, Denise. And I know Denise will be with us for the question and answer period. And I'm sure what she had to say provoked some thoughts in the minds of American parents and teachers as to what goes on in American schools. Let me once again urge people to join the Schiller Institute. The next issue of the Leonora publication, which you will get if you become a member of the Schiller Institute, will actually carry a couple of papers by Schiller Institute leaders on this question of education, the education of Humboldt and the West, and what is going on in China. So please do that. Now we're actually going to hear from a teacher in China, Mr. Zhu Huang, who is the executive dean of the Boao Culture and Creativity Institute. And he seems to have a particular emphasis on architecture, which I think you'll find quite interesting and delightful. His talk is entitled On the Aesthetic Education in China.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Zhu Huang. I'm the General Secretary of SMART, Integrated Resort Committee, Vice Dean of Boao Culture and Creative Institute, and also I'm the founder of MKids. Today, I'm very delighted to share some experience about kids' aesthetic education in China, because currently our kids' education are still focused on exam and solid knowledge transfer in China instead of ability and methodology and vision. What we've been focused on is so-called future education system, which will adapt to current trend and technology, get the kids learn their skill and sharpen their ability by play and interaction and also experience. For that goal, we will build Children's Museum, Ideas Club, Future Education Platform Complex to ensure our kids learn from the task, from the practice. Instead of traditional aesthetic education, we include the art education into design, because my background is an architect. So first, the kids have to know what is the standard for beauty, for pretty, and how you define and evaluate it. Then cooperate this ability into design task to practice it in real situation for real problem solving. We hold a competition last year for kids aged from 6 to 10 to design a future school, which the kids like most for themselves. From this task and result-oriented exercise, you can clearly see the difference from different kids. Their ability varies, but all significant and super smart. Some of them are really good at freehand drawing, and some of them really love to do the handmade models. And of course, some of them are really into the games, so they build their small world with Minecraft by significant work. So this competition called Future School, and it took 3 months for the kids to learn about architecture, to learn about how to draw, and also how to build models. And we have a very strong jury members from Tsinghua, Tongji, and CAFA, and also from various education institute. So this is our final. We have 36 kids out of hundreds of kids, who win their honor as candidate for the final prize. Those are all very young and little kids, and they're daring to speak about their ideas in front of hundreds of audience, which is amazing. And we all feel they're so brave. One of the jury member is my professor from my university. So she mentioned that all these kids, they did a great work than what you guys did when you were in the freshman year for undergrad school. I believe so, because these kids, they're not limited by skills or a setup rules for architecture. They're full of imagination, and with the right tool to teach them about the design thinking and also hands-on making models and drawings, they really did a great job. Because all this design work are goal-oriented or final result-oriented. So all the kids starting to finding their own site. Some of them looking into a school in desert because they want to teach the kids to learn about how to maintain the environment for a better world. And also some kids decide to put their school under the sea. They're starting to looking into methods how to transfer human down underneath like 500 meters below the sea. And they're starting to find their way for all those mechanisms. And some of them, it's their first time to cutting the models for the cardboard. And you can see, they did a great job to decorate their own design, and also with different shapes as well. And from this kind of task, the kids starting to learn about material, color, and 3D layers, and also the different material showing the different texture. This little kindergarten for the cow, the kids have all different schools for different animals, and some of their school even for aliens. It's really inspiring for us. All the professional architects and the teachers, when they see this innovative design, it's all get amazed. And also, when the kids first time getting to know about the structure, about the material contrast, for the solid and also the transparency, how the light coming in and with the angles across the horizon. They also decorating their work with different background, flowers and grassland and forest. It's really a nice touch for the kids utilize their aesthetic training into something real and to put it into an environment where they can create their own object and to fulfill their goal for a school actually that they're desired and they're willing to go to. And for this one, they're not only showing a really beautiful and rich color layers for the grassland, as well, they're using some traditional tent architecture from Inner Mongolia and to put it into this stand and to make it really surrounded by the natural environment. A lot of this young kids, they have amazing skill of making drawings and with colors. For example, this one, she's really good at freehand drawing. She starts with single point and single line. She's very easy to draw all over the place on this drawing. And then with a task for design and architecture, it's be her first time to learn how to utilize the shape, color, and different thickness of the lines in a three-dimensional way to just getting a more task-oriented learning process. For example, they get to learn about the environment, they got to learn about structure, and how to making the contrast between the different materials, and learn about the space. I think the aesthetic recognition of space, of architecture, of urban design, of our surrounding environment. This is our everyday use of aesthetic and our everyday understanding about art. So that is a more important feature for this competition is trying to do. And as what we mentioned before, some of these boys, they're more good at handmade model. The one on the left, he's making this amazing white structure, which is very abstract, referred to, the white models for professional architects. But they made a very complex layers of space, and they're trying to creating the structure to make it reasonable and exploring, how people or users moving through into the space, which is amazing. And on the right-hand side, they already understand to superimpose the traditional Chinese architecture in the nature, in the water and mountain, to be contrast with the super high rise of the CBD of Beijing, which is an amazing idea to learn about the scale and the different sensation of traditional Chinese garden versus the contemporary, Beijing CBD architecture with all this high rise and steel structure, which we think it's a great way to not only learn about art, but also about social, about history, about all this human relationship and some psychology features as well. And this competition actually goes for 6 months, including the process where the kids learn how to making architecture, and sometimes they did their own study and research about a certain environment where they want to put their buildings. And afterwards, we have this show where the kids are freely to describe their design proudly to many different audience. And we also feel proud of them because the kids' imagination, they almost covered all the different environment situation in China, across the China, from the mountain to the ocean. from the grassland to the desert, from the high-rise, high-dense city center to the rural village and farmland. They really have a big heart to discover and observing our world, and also giving out their own solution. They're not afraid of have a public speech about their design, about their viewpoint, and about their opinion. And on the other hand, because of their creating the models together, it's kind of competition. So they learned how to work in a team and for the future leadership as well. So I feel, in the future, the aesthetic design, aesthetic education, or the art education shouldn't be limited into creating pretty drawings and paintings only. That should be a fundamental ability for kids. But how to utilize all this ability into solving real problem, and also to creating something more complex for kids to willing to explore the world by themselves and finding all the answers with their own hands and eyes. That is our point. So we are really looking forward to figure out new ways, not only for the kids' design and art competition, but also we're looking into creating this integrated resort for kids, like the Ideas Kids Club, Children's Museum, and also Future Education Complex. So we think this is a holistic system for the kids, in this age, with a lot of aid from the computer, from the internet, or from the metaverse, but they still have to utilize their ability of seeking and touching and hands-on to find a better way to explore themselves. And that's our share for today about our aesthetic education in China currently. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And again, that was Mr. Zhu Huang, who is the Executive Dean of the Boao Culture and Creativity Institute. And I'm thinking that those cows probably get a better education in the Chinese kindergarten where the child put them than children in our kindergartens in the United States. We are now going to go to Professor Ole Düring, who is a sinologist and philosopher from Germany. Hello, I see that you're there. Welcome. He is an expert on the ethics of technology, culture, and health, and has been traveling back and forth between China and Germany for a little while, I guess about 25 years or so. So Professor Düring will speak with us on education.
Thank you very much, Diane. I hope you can hear me because I'm speaking live from Berlin. Greetings to all over the world. Thank you for the Schiller Institute for providing this fascinating opportunity to reach out and interact with so many people all over the world. It looks like when I'm considering the two last talks that we just heard, that talking about China seems prone to bring a kind of fresh and hopeful perspective into the entire discussion. And I can only second my previous speakers in their perception of Chinese education, or rather of the generations that are now receiving and really reinventing education in China. I'm teaching in China in several universities for many years. I've been a full professor at Changsha, that is the University of Changsha in southern China. And I can only say that my students there are extremely eager, extremely bright, and they are not at all under the impression that they know too much enough. And my German students sometimes could really benefit from such an attitude and the ability to make use of it. Today, I would like to briefly about a dialogue or argue for a dialogue of civilizations, that in this we depend on collaborative with China. I put this into a philosophical perspective, and I start with some context. I call this first part of my 4 parts, Preparing the Soil for Spring. Just go back a few decades. After 1979, China opened up and set out to get better. How this would be accomplished and what it actually meant was not clear at that time. That, however, was the beginning of an unprecedented learning exercise. In fact, much of the breathtaking achievement commonwealth that we are all witnesses of is a subject that sounds like, let's find out how, not just to get better, but also what that really means and how it is done best. This self-reflection took place behind the scenes, in connotations, in sciences, among the political leadership, while performing increasingly well in building the economy, infrastructures, and these things could gradually serve greater goods remained open. The success was some of the wagons of the famous train that Deng Xiaoping had ingeniously invented, directing all resources towards the driving locomotive power of individual creativity. The task at hand was to survive and to consolidate as life went on. Self-reflected learning and adjustment of the course continued and grew better in the wake as well. Then, starting 2 decades later in the 1990s, viable growth of power was the next step on the global scale. It was the time to establish China at the appropriate level among nations. China's aspirations grew through the international institutions like the WTO and the framework of the United Nations, so that it now assumes proper responsibilities in global governance and masters the instruments of international diplomacy and law. Recently, a dual circulation marks the next step in this process. The timing was forced by foreign aggression and started probably slightly premature, yet it is a sound continuation of the learning approach. As a sovereign nation, China reclaims control after 2 decades of strategic opening. For example, it disengages unhealthy connections with commercial providers of education services. It redirects and aligns education to the thereby exercising responsibility for social welfare and public health, as well as care of disadvantaged citizens for access to proper education, securing the standards of balanced growth in its own terms and by its own means. China would never be a nation that is satisfied with copycat approaches, neither on the small scale action, nor blueprints for science and education industries, nor regarding its political system. It wants to do it right, that is stood as learning to get better. This rationale naturally indicates that failure and errors must be conceded and mended properly. Responsibility is a social asset. It resonates with and affects all policy areas. Evidently, the stakes are high, considering competitive environment fueled by campaigns showing distrust and undermining China's public face, and that are mostly based on ignorance or hostility. Number 2, governing growth. How can civility prevail? After systematic regulation and legislation started in the 90s as an exercise in social engineering, experimenting with differences of leaning towards participation or authority, huge infrastructure initiatives were rolled out with the Belt and Road Initiative and domestic development that was soon combined with attention to soft skills. The importance of trust and collaboration across cultures and strata Skillful social engagement is instrumental. With more well-educated, diversified, and demanding relations to be accounted for, a New Deal is required. It trusts in responsible innovation in the public and private sectors of social goods, first of all in education. This way enables continuation of learning and adjustment. Other sectors will follow that path, such as health and environment, that have suffered a lot from neoliberal global culture. Other areas will be particularly sensitive, such as control over commercial, digital, and AI technologies. As long as the social contract holds and stability can be maintained, it is possible that this course will be maintained by integrating ever-increasing populations as beneficiaries. This is how, ever since the educational reforms inspired by Zhu Huang, who was living from 1130 to 1200 in China, the Song dynasty, cultivation and power have been enshrined as the yin and yang of China's prosperity as a country. Mandarins installed meritocracy as a model for legitimate role, vitalized by education as the motor of social mobility. This was not mere academic philosophy, but philosophical insight at work for social goods. This ultimate tertium comparationis for all reason-guided thinking is missing today if we seriously wish to get beyond the silos of thinking in terms of nations, languages, stakes, and disciplines that connect us according to the beauty of true human nature. Self-centered cultures of philosophy did not fare well in their passage into the globalized 21st century. As a corresponding cultural horizon with our global realities, philosophy proper can be reinvented and become an inspiration for humane cooperation. This is a shared task, a unified philosophical curriculum that integrates the classical scholarship of world philosophies, such as Chinese and European traditions, does not yet exist in academic institutions, neither in China nor in Germany, nor, as I hear, in the United States. The need for and potential benefit from such a renaissance is so strikingly obvious, and the material and political investments required so marginal that reason will not serve as an explanation for its absence. We can do it when we do what these philosophical traditions have always done initially: pursue, explore, and criticize enlightenment. The future is an open together in a common language. Which language could that be? Integrating and expressing all knowledge that is born within our natural tongues and horizons of cultural experience. 3. Sustainable growth. Let us consult that knowledge. The book of the philosopher Mengzi, who was living in the 4th century BC, claims and provides ample evidence for being justified in this claim that, I'm quoting, "I understand words. I am good at nourishing my intelligible spirit or qi," end of quote. The philosopher Mengzi indicated that this should be the language of philosophy that enables reflected reflection and guided action from one ultimate connecting source of reasoning. At his time, he argued against utilitarian behaviorists such as the philosopher Gao or Gaozi. His main point was that understanding human nature, ontology, epistemology, and ethics means to claim responsibility for human action and match aspirations with competence. The root knowledge and the driving motives are self-regulated. He tells us a parable, the story of the man from the state of Song who went to, and this is the name of that story, pull the sprouts to make them grow. And I'm quoting, "There was a man in Song who was annoyed that his growing corn was not longer, and so he pulled it up. Having done this, he returned home looking very stupid and said to his people, "Now I'm so tired, I've been helping the corn to grow." His son ran to look at it and found the corn all withered. There are few in the world who do not make an effort for the corn to grow. Some find it useless to care, stay at home and do not weed the weed. Those who add effort to make it grow pull out the corn. What they do is not only without benefit, it is even harmful. There are few in the world who do not make effort for the corn to grow longer. Some find it useless. This is a very important allusion to the way in which we need to balance education in the sense of engineering and the education in the sense of humanism. The story is an illustration of a well-explained philosophy. Human intelligence can transform natural intelligibility by providing a perspective of rights, of propriety, of balance, and healthy relationships. It explores the possible unity of knowledge and action, the connectivity of technology and life, how to achieve a balance between proper nourishment and avoiding harm due to overly eager effort. Asked to define the essence of that connectivity, Mongso says, quoting again, "This is Qi, the proper intelligible spirit. It fuses together righteousness, Yi, and the way, Tao. Without it, without that Qi, there is starvation. This Qi assembles righteousness, Yi, for creativity, for life, for giving birth, for producing. And it cannot be obtained by assembling the Yi with effort. So no forced innovation. When action disagrees with our heart, it starves. This is why I say Gaozi has never tasted the knowledge of right, because he externalizes it. In all affairs we cannot do without adjustment, so that the heart does not forget, and growth comes without an effort. Intellectuals such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Matteo Ricci found a deep sympathetic reason in these tidings they received about Chinese philosophy at their times. That was taken up by German Weimar classics, especially Schiller and Goethe, in their philosophical thoughts about pedagogy and education. There is an intrinsic connection in the aspiration for truth, beauty, and good. It is a hope and a promise for those who chose the path of Bildung or Xue, cultivating learning, becoming the human being who we can want to be, expressing our inner knowledge while learning from reflected experience and guidance. Ethics. Schiller's Spieltrieb, the drive to play, keeps us on the move, exercise and reassess the rules of the game of life. Along the path of action, this recipe for sustainable growth is not limited to economy or prudential plotting, but it is cultivated by humaneness and cultivated humaneness in an open process of all humankind. In the big picture, China started to learn from others in the 1970s. It began learning with others in the 1990s and provides opportunities for mutual learning while advancing the quality of the learning what matters. What can countries such as Germany offer to China so that it doesn't submit to the temptation to learn for others? Let us heal and nourish our roots as humans. Let us raise our proper intelligible spirit and allow it to boundlessly flow. This is a call that actually connects Schiller with Confucius, in that they both believe that this process is intimately connected with joy. You cannot really say joy because it is Freude in German and it's Yue in Chinese. This is a deeper sense of joy that is described as the spark of the gods, Götterfunken, in Schiller. And this is, in a way, corresponding with the qi, with what we feel when we exercise the assembly of knowledge through the Tao and righteousness. Thank you for your attention, and of course I'm here for any comments or questions you might have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And now I suppose I have to introduce myself. I have a short presentation which has been inspired also in part from my work and discussions with a number of American teachers. So as I said at the beginning of this panel, I'm Diane Sayre, and I am the founder of the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus and a longtime associate of the late American genius Lyndon LaRouche. My presentation is titled, How the World Health Platform Will Save the Future of the West. The crisis in education is not just a crisis in education. What we are witnessing is a total breakdown of society. At least I'll speak for the United States, and I suspect Western Europe as well. What else can we conclude when the head of the World Food Program, David Beasley, says that a mere $7 billion could prevent tens of millions of people from dying of starvation, and no individual, no group of individuals steps forward to do anything about it? People tend to have a mistaken idea of what education is. Maybe they think it's memorizing a bunch of facts or developing a proficiency in some area or a skill. But what is the difference between that and teaching a circus animal to do tricks? Of course, with the collapse of literacy and any standard in American public schools, even the circus animal conception of standards no longer exists unless you consider playing video games a skill. In a 1999 policy paper about education, Lyndon LaRouche writes that the turning point in a child's development is the realization of the meaning of death, not witnessing the death of a loved one, a particular person, a relative, but the idea that death is the inevitable conclusion for every single person now living. This understanding, LaRouche asserts, is not a cause for pessimism, but a cause for optimism, especially as the child has the experience through education of reliving the process of making discoveries of universal principle, which were made by people who are nominally now dead. He or she experiences the discovery as alive, living in his or her own mind. So how do we get there from here? I spoke with a teacher on the West Coast who told me that in her school, and this probably is now common, 6- and 7-year-old children do not know the sounds associated with letters or the numbers from 1 to 20. Partly, this is a result of the pandemic, where children have been out of school for nearly 2 years, and in many cases, if they are poor, stuck in small apartments with their iPhone or iPad screens. This teacher told me that on Monday mornings, her students all are completely crazy and out of sorts, as if they're going through some kind of addiction, withdrawal from these screens. She reported that a 2nd grade teacher in her school lamented, "We're supposed to be teaching these children in 2nd grade to write sentences, but they don't even know the alphabet. I know they don't understand anything that I am supposed to be teaching them, and I feel like a terrible person for doing this. We need to go back to kindergarten," unquote. How does one address this? Clearly, the curricula developed by people like Humboldt and Herbart would be a starting point for an educational program, but we also have to do something urgently right now to change the culture as a whole. We have millions and millions of people in their late teens and 20s who will not have time to master classical Greek and 3 other languages before they have to function as adults, before they must address the crises that they themselves are facing. I've come to the conclusion that Helga Zepp-LaRouche's World Health Platform, combined with Dr. Joycelyn Elder's Youth Medical Corps, is the solution to this problem. If it is true that the purpose of education is the development of character, or a beautiful soul, as Schiller might say, then the moral person is the person who acts for the common good, or the general welfare, as it says in the US Constitution. This is an educated person. In the Montgomery bus boycott, as led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he took people through a crash course of character and moral transformation in just 1 year, in a way that does not now occur in 15 years of so-called education. And I think that this result derived from what Lyndon LaRouche said about discovering the meaning of death. Since death is the inevitable end, what does life mean? In Montgomery, Alabama, the question of being treated like an animal by a person acting like an animal who believed that he or she was superior because of the color or lack thereof of their skin, clearly was a violation of the principle of the dignity of human life. What the people decided, with Rosa Parks taking the first courageous action on December 1st, 1955, was that they would no longer participate in a system of injustice. Very rapidly, the entire Black population of Montgomery, Alabama, joined the bus boycott, and the effect was felt, but not enough to get a change, at least not right away. Starting the boycott in winter was tough. While Alabama may not be as cold as Buffalo, New York, the winters can bring a little snow and a lot of cold, rain, and mud. People had to trek for miles in adverse conditions, but they were proud and they carried themselves with dignity. As the months wore on, carpools were organized, and the Black-owned taxi companies would shuttle people for the same fare as what they could pay on the bus, but the town quickly, or the city of Montgomery, quickly made that illegal. White women who depended on their Black domestic help took turns picking up their workers all over town. And a man named John King, whom we had the honor of meeting there in 1992 when some of us were working on Mr. LaRouche's presidential campaign, told us how he and other postal workers who were familiar with the layout of the city would map out all of the carpool routes. This required great coordination and attention to detail, as well as willingness to endure physical hardship while enjoying the liberation of not participating in injustice. This boycott lasted over an entire year. When the word came that the U.S. Supreme Court had upheld the ruling of the federal court in Alabama that bus segregation was unconstitutional and in violation of the 14th Amendment, and it took time because the city and the bus company had appealed that decision, so it went to the Supreme Court in December of 1956. Hundreds of residents gathered in 2 large churches to decide whether to continue the boycott until the Supreme Court decision was officially delivered to Montgomery and the bus company forced to comply. It was, of course, agreed that after all this, no one was going to set foot on a segregated bus, and they could wait a few more days. In one of the churches, a white minister from the North was giving the sermon, and he was reciting 1 Corinthians 13. And when he said, "When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put aside childish things. The last phrase could barely be heard over the cheering and clapping and shouting. This is the transformation of our population, which is so desperately needed today. What would be the effect of young Americans or young Europeans enrolling in a crash program to become medical workers to save lives, or in an even shorter training session to deliver food and nutrition to starving children in Haiti, Yemen, or Afghanistan? Consider the kind of mobilization which would be required to ensure that not one person in the United States or anywhere in the world ever went to bed hungry. What would that require of the people carrying it out? As Leibniz has told us, there is not one evil which does not provide the opportunity for a greater good. So I will ask you now, who is in more desperate need? The children of Afghanistan or the children of the West, who are quickly destroying their own future? It may be that the starving and desperate people, whether they are in Kabul or the South Bronx, Haiti or West Virginia, Yemen or Buffalo, will be the ones to save the West by pricking the shriveled up conscience of our people and allowing us to regain our dignity and humanity by doing what is necessary to save millions of lives. Thank you. So with that, my thoughts, I think I have heard a rumor that Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, has joined us. And I would ask her if she has any responses to what she's heard on this panel.
Well, I'm actually very happy, despite the, in part, very alarming and terrible assessments like from Professor Wahab, which unfortunately, we know that that is the situation. But, I was extremely happy when I heard the sequence of discussions from Denise, Rainey, because it confirms everything I have observed with my own experiences in China. And then we heard from Zhu Huang elaborating on what they are doing, and then Professor Döring sort of giving it the theoretical background. So I think this package, we should really, and naturally what you said, Diane, which I naturally fully agree with, because, ever since the pandemic started, or shortly there, immediately it was clear that it would only stop if there would be a world health system, meaning a modern health system in every single country on the planet. And that has not changed. As a matter of fact, the short-sightedness of the rich countries to only care for their own vaccine and completely ignore, the needs of the developing countries, and the fact that it would be a meager 6 billion, 7 billion to save presently 45 million people from the immediate danger of starvation, and the West not being capable of mobilizing this. I think we are at a point where both the collapse of the neoliberal system, with all of its implications, especially the moral aspect of it, is so absolutely clear. And it is also clear that the establishments, at least so far, are in no position and have shown no inclination to reflect on why the Western system is doing so poorly. That I really think, what the Schiller Institute was setting out from the very beginning in 1984, but sometimes it takes a while before ideas find the right moment, namely the idea that we need a Renaissance movement, because we need a movement of people, of education, of goodwill, of humanist conviction, who think that the present condition of humanity is not tolerable anymore. And that therefore, we create a movement of people who say we need a renaissance of the best traditions, a dialogue of cultures where each nation and each civilization brings forward their best tradition and make it available to the other one so that they know about it. And I think that can become a very powerful counter movement against the present decay, what we see, what Jacques was talking about with the Squid Game and similar bestial. I don't even want to say that animals, because no animal does this. This is much, much worse than any animal is capable of. So I think, to combine all of these efforts, the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, which we heard yesterday speaking about, it's already in motion. It can be built, it can be made grown. And then adopt the cases of Haiti and Afghanistan as the two most urgent cases where, a complete intervention in terms of humanitarian aid, but then also basic economic reconstruction has to occur, and combine that with the idea of a training program for young people to give them a mission and a task. And in the case of Afghanistan, let's call this Operation Ibn Sina, because, Ibn Sina was one of the greatest universal thinkers of universal history. You can put him on one level with thinkers like Plato, Confucius, Schiller, and Leibniz, and many others. And, to give the effort to save Afghanistan a beautiful image of man of genius, because, we are talking about saving the souls of humanity. Schiller wanted to have as an ideal, everybody has the potential to have a beautiful soul, but his definition of beautiful soul was a genius, because only the genius is the person for whom freedom and necessity, passion and duty are falling into once, and it's only the genius who enlarges the rules in a lawful way. And so the idea of a beautiful soul and a genius, I mean, Ibn Sina is a perfect example of that, because he was an absolutely outstanding independent and original thinker who was not only transmitting from the Greek period a lot of concepts, he added some very important philosophical conceptions, like the idea of the necessary existent, which again influenced people like Thomas of Aquinas, Dante, Nicolaus of Cruz, and many others. So I think that would be a perfect way to give it some, let's say, almost an ontological depth of doing this, because we are fighting for in one sense, the survival of civilization. Not only because of the danger of nuclear war, but essentially, are we human? Are we the human species? And can we uphold that human quality in a moment of crisis like that? So I would say, what I have heard in terms of the presentations is extremely encouraging, and we should discuss it some more.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. So I think now we'll bring everybody up on the screen who is with us. And people may have thoughts as we go. If you do, you can just raise your hand. Here we go. Do we have, okay, Jacques, and there's oh, good. We got everyone. Welcome. So I think actually I'm going to start this with a question for Sayre Wahab, since he also had some things he wanted to bring up from an earlier panel when he wasn't able to get on. And then we'll go from there. The question is from Suzanne, and she writes, I read that Afghanistan had one astronaut go into space, spending 9 days aboard the Mir space station with the Soyuz TM-6 Soviet mission in 1988. This is Abdul Ahad Mohmand, who was evidently educated at Kabul University. Can you tell us about the quality of advanced education in engineering in Afghanistan and its status now, as the number of trained engineers that might be involved in reconstructing the country? She said, I also noted that NASA sent a group of U.S. astronauts to meet with Afghan pilots in 2011, including Neil Armstrong, Gene Cernan, and Jim Lovell at NATO, went to the Mission Afghanistan headquarters in 2011. Coming from a country of scholars which during the Islamic Renaissance made breakthroughs in astronomy, is the space program a big influence in Afghanistan today? We note that the first Islamic mission to another planet is now ongoing with the mission to Mars from the United Arab Emirates. And then she asked if you would comment on Helga LaRouche's proposal for the Project Ibn Sina. And finally, if you can tell us about the impact of the Taliban schools and fundamentalist Islam. Can you comment on education under the Taliban? So there you go. That's a lot.
Well, yes, it is indeed. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the Schiller Institute and the panelists and the musical at the beginning. And I apologize for not being able to join you yesterday. There were some technical difficulties, and therefore I was not able to join. And this morning, listening to the musical, which was beautiful, it sort of epitomized the beauty in every sense, figuratively and literally. And I was watching the pictures when I was listening to Beethoven and watching the children's picture. I kept thinking about, there was a group of Afghan children, obviously, and they were Afghan. And I kept thinking, how many of these children and many more like them will be able to survive this winter and the famine and perhaps extinction. And it's very troubling. And if I had been there yesterday, I really had some things to say to Mrs. Malik and to Dr. Mehrabi, especially to Dr. Mehrabi, as being director of the central bank in Afghanistan. And I wanted to ask him where he was when Mr. Ajmal Ahmadi, the President Ghani's distant relative, was the director, who is a Lebanese, and also where was Mr. Mehrabi when the bank was emptied of all of its resources, when there was massive corruption, when the bank was treated as private property, and when Mr. Yamas Siawesh was butchered, the famous journalist, the very lovable journalist and then bank worker. And what happened to when the cigar reports were coming out? Did Dr. Mehrabi read these reports? Did he know about the emptiness of the bank? Did he know about the murders? Did he know about Mr. Ajmal Ahmadi and why he allowed this disaster? And I wanted to talk to Mrs. Malik, that it was Pakistan that has been involved in meddling in Afghan affairs for the last 40 years, even during President Dawood in the 1970s, early 1970s. And then it was Pakistan, along with Saudi Arabia and Washington, that overthrew the progressive government in the late 1970s, who wanted to move Afghanistan from the Middle Ages to perhaps at least the 20th century. And I wish that Mrs. Malik would sort of publish her speech in some Pakistani newspaper. But anyway, I missed it. So I'm sorry, I didn't know anything about this space exploration. Must confess, I'm not really interested. It's not one of my priorities. And it's not what Afghanistan needs right now. What Afghanistan needs is the UN tells us, other agencies, the European Union, the World Food Program, the UNHCR, the UNDP and everybody else, is there's most of the people right now cannot eat. Most of them are hungry, famished, but also poverty and hunger would reach almost 100%, and there will be massive, in fact, uh, um, death, in the country, and that the world needs to act very quickly. Um, so, in the last 20 years, I've spent more than half of my time over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, traveling between Lewis and Clark College and Afghanistan, where we try to sort of modernize the educational system, in particular higher education. We tried. Of course, when I arrived in the former minister, Dr. Fayez, in early 2002, higher education, like the rest of education, was simply a skeleton. And we tried to build both the quality and quantity of education at all levels. And by early 2021, there were many institutions, private and public institutions at all levels. And there was a system that you could call the education system, although there was much to be desired in terms of both quality and quantity. That is, access, equity, equality, democracy, resources, money, buildings, professors, school teachers, the curriculum, teaching methods, etc. We had still had to make a lot of progress, but all of that sort of was disrupted on August 15th, which of course was the doing of Washington and Ashraf Ghani and his gang. And no one is really addressing this question of why and how did this happen? Were Washington and Kabul asleep? Were they reluctant? Were they resistant? Did they not want actually a stable, progressing Afghanistan? And why is it that Washington and Ashraf Ghani and his gang are not being held accountable right now to account for their crimes against the Afghan people and humanity? And so, right now, as we know, most educational institutions from first grade through college are closed. They're not really functioning. The system is being disrupted. A lot of school teachers and professors are leaving and have left. There are no buildings. There's no security in a way. There was no security. Most institutions are closed for boys and for girls, for men and for women. Although theoretically, the boys and men's schools are open, but then hardly functioning. For girls, up to sixth grade, there are schools, and most of them are open. And in some cases, schools for girls between the seventh and 12th grade have also been open. But there's fear, there's concern, there's intimidation, there are cultural barriers, there are difficulties. And so very few people, teachers, faculty, and students actually report. Even this morning, a former professor of the university was talking to me that, Kabul University, in fact, is closed. It's not really functioning. So that's, education. But I really want to indulge your patience for a minute. As I said, Afghanistan is in crisis. It's a catastrophe. It's a disaster. I would say it was one of the biggest crimes of the century. And the United States and its partners are responsible for this. And so is the Afghan government, the previous government. Right now, the United States must recognize and engage the Taliban and normalize relationships with it. The United States must apologize to the Afghan nation for imposing the misery that they're suffering. The United States must release all of the Afghanistan's money from the United States, from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund.
Professor Wahab,
yes.
sorry,
In other
I
words,
appreciate
the United States must do something to end this tragedy once and for all.
Okay. Thank you very much for your thoughts. I think that's fine. I understand. And I would like to give Helga an opportunity to address some of what you said, if she would like to do that.
Good. Okay.
Well, I think some of it we discussed in previous conferences, starting with the Schiller conference in July, where we went into the reasons that the Afghanistan war was ill-defined from the very beginning. It was clear to the military of the United States, of the Europeans, that it was completely untenable in 2010. The Afghanistan papers. I'm only references that you came now new into the discussion, but we had a lot of these discussions, and I would urge you to go to the conferences we have on archive on our website, because we are in the middle of trying to solve all of that. And I fully agree that a lot of crimes were committed, and I also think the non-action of the West right now, after they did this to the Afghanistan people for 20 years, leaving the country without an economic anything. They spent 2 trillion, the United States alone, and then the German Bundeswehr another 60 billion or something, but nothing is left. 2 weeks after the previous government had left and the US left, it turns out there was zero. Nothing has been invested. So this is a crime, and I absolutely insist that the West, the United States and European nations and all NATO members who were there have an absolute responsibility to step in. To release the fund is the bare minimum, because this is the money belonging to the Afghan people. And given the fact that, according to Beasley, 95% of the people are in acute danger of dying of hunger and cold. I mean, that is the reality to start with. Now, I mean, you may think about the Taliban, whatever you want to think about, but talking about women's rights and not trying to save the life of 95% of the women, is obviously, it shows you the hypocrisy of a lot of this discussion. So I just wanted to say that, and I would really encourage you to help us, because we are trying to put together an alliance of people to put, the solutions, the short-term humanitarian aid, but also to integrate Afghanistan into the Belt and Road Initiative projects, which is the only feasible perspective to have a real economic development in the short term. So I just wanted to say that, because, I understand that you are under an enormous, pressure because of the situation, but I also want to tell you that we have considered a lot of the things you said already.
Good. Thank you.
Is Jacques Cheminade still with us? I see a black screen. There he is. So I would like perhaps Jacques, who is speaking, but I can't hear you. So make sure you're unmuted. And Ola During, both Jacques first, if you would like to respond to what you've heard or what Robert Beltran said. Jacques, go ahead.
Well, Helga said something extremely powerful yesterday, is when there are divisions or fights, either at the level of states or at the level of persons, to solve the situation, you have to do something good for the other. And this is a principle of the advantage of the other of the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, this, as Diane's stress, should take the form of sending immediately teams of youth to help in medical services and be trained right on the spot, or also bringing food to the starving children in these countries. But this has to be done with the people, the teams of people are sent there who should live with the population. There are examples of so-called cooperation where people who would cooperate were apart from the population. They had been inside the population and knowing the history and progressively sharing what the population went through in its history. And it's the same, in a way, in a theater play. If you know only your part in a theater play, you make a disgrace of yourself. You have to know the part of every person in the play. And then you have a sense of the intention, the unity and the intention of the other. It's the same also in music, which is beautiful example that you brought, which is the choral music, where many create a unity, and this unity is a principle of cross voices, and it creates this unity with a composition and intention of the other. So this advantage of the other is something that is our way, or it's a way for humanity to solve the problems where we are. And I think that people who are involved in all I showed at the beginning could step out of this universe if they have this personal sense of something which is over them and which defines what they are as human beings, creating for the advantage of the other.
Thank you. Very well said. Professor During?
Thank you. If I may, I would like to respond to both interventions. First, in the same line that we just heard, but being a philosopher engaged in global health ethics in particular for some time, I'd just like to say that the basic thing we need is honesty, a very profound and very simple virtue. Honesty and integrity in doing what we say we want and only what we can do. And this would be a recipe that is as old as humankind's philosophy, so as true as ever. And it will, well, actually show that all our excuses for not acting properly in the area of health policies are just excuses. So one perhaps provocative remark I would say make, and the other is, well, when we're talking about education systems and cultures, and we hear about gods and invention and inventiveness, well, we should talk about Prometheus, and we should talk about the relationship, or we should talk about the role of the Greek gods actually in the background of our modern world. It's very interesting that Hitler and Goethe and the Weimar classics were benefiting Renaissance understanding that there's an agreement between monotheism and the ancient Greek Olympic pantheon. But what I would rather aim at now in this short comment is to share with you what we are teaching these in China. I'm actually right now, during this semester, which is half over now, I'm teaching 2 classes about appreciation of Greek and Roman myths and mythology. And there's one thing that very frequently get first introduce the main narratives. First, of course, well, it is entirely new to these Chinese students. They have their own myths, their own mythology, their own gods that they learn about. But when they look at what we depict as the pantheon in the ancient context, they find surprising because there's no good role model there. They say, well, what's the point of having gods that don't behave well and how to do it properly? They ask, well, how can Zeus be so polygamous? And how can there be so much shifting of identities and realities, connectivities and all that? Well, of course, I try to explain as a philosopher how this makes a lot of sense. And I'm referring to Nietzsche's explanation about tragedy and how this helps us to overcome a deep set for pessimism in that context. I think this meeting of ancient European and ancient Chinese tradition in the young classrooms now, this is a good opportunity to start interacting, really, and to giving up our claim that our narratives that are so much influenced by our deep-set prejudices our not reflected prejudices about monotheism, about being right, about, well, accept the other, but not really being prepared to sometimes eat from the other. So we can overcome that. And I think we have very good reason, at least to appreciate and the good in looking for good role model. The world is getting increasingly complex, complicated, and for many people pointless. So let's make the best of the little good that we actually have, that we can show, try to explain how this can work across cultures and to mobilize cultures. I would like to make this a little bit optimistic note in this little comment of mine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Now, a couple of questions have come in for Denise Rainey, and also Sayre, you may have some thoughts on this as well. It's about American education today. Someone writes, many thanks on your honest first-person report on China's national commitment to the educational and cultural development of all of its students. You rightly hearken back to the 60s as the endpoint of a mission-oriented, educational, and culturally optimistic USA. As a career educator and administrator, can you contrast the effects of this leap backwards on our teachers, as also compared to teachers in China? And then someone else writes, can you describe your sense of American urban education today, strengths, weaknesses, etc.? Someone said there's no sound. There is, okay, then that's, okay, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, in answer to the second question, I need a webinar devoted to just that very question. But in answer to the question about the impact on teachers, yes, from my observation and experience, American teachers are very discouraged now. What you heard from a teacher in California is probably universal in American urban districts. Pre-kindergarten students and kindergarten students are not coming in with basic foundations for literacy readiness. And so students do not have the most basic skills intact. So in first and second grade, while teachers should be teaching students to decode words and become fluent oral readers, and by third grade to become fluent comprehenders of what they read, instead they're teaching the alphabet and the sounds associated with the letters and very, very basic pre-literacy skills. By contrast, the foundational skills in China are taught so systematically that we're not seeing the gaps in Chinese students that we see in American students. The system in the United States for addressing remediation or to help students gain skills that they're behind in is very complex. The funding of American education is complex. It's different in urban districts than it is in suburban districts. And that again would take some lengthy explanation, not worth going into, but suffice it to say that what we hear, Title I funding or the big No Child Left Behind legislation, those are complicated funding and legislation systems that do not get remedial education directly to students as quickly as needed. Those sources of fundings are issued to districts through block grants and through bits of legislation that bear politicians' names, and therefore they have lots of criteria over how those services are to be delivered when the funding does make it down to the district level. Consequently, over time, the academic gap widens, seriously widens, between urban students who come in with default skills against their suburban counterparts. On the other hand, in China, the financing of education is simple. It's cut and dry. It's government funded. I saw many examples of very rural Chinese schools being given as much consideration in terms of materials and resources as their urban counterparts. So the emphasis on experiences, on literacy, on access to children's books, on access to curriculum is not as discrepant as it is in the US. You don't see that tremendous gap between urban offerings and rural offerings in China. In China, students have a very clear path to their curriculums. And what's going on now is a new or renewed emphasis in China on classical education and teaching of the arts, not in a superficial way that we see often in American schools where elementary students or secondary students might go to a 45 to 1 hour, 45 minutes, 1 hour class in art once a week, or they may have an art class on their high school schedule. But art education in the US tends to be superficial, as the professor was saying. The emphasis is on product, the production of a painting or a drawing or a series of visual pieces that can be entered into a local competition or shared in some kind of a school display. The emphasis in arts education going on in China right now is not superficial in that way, but deep enough to trigger reflection on the question of what does it mean to be human? And this very essence that we've been talking about of the impact of classical education. If I am human, what is my responsibility to my community and to my nation? And what does that look like for me as a citizen of China and as a global citizen? We don't have those discussions in American schools. American schools have gotten so far off track that our ability to compete academically with our international cohorts is vastly, sadly deteriorated. I think Americans, just like Sputnik was a wake-up call in the 60s, I think Americans who are constantly told that we have the best universities and the best educational system have no clue what's going on in other countries and have no clue how very, very far behind we are. And I think that in 10 years, 15 years, when Americans finally get some recognition of the fact that China will have long surpassed us in sciences and the arts, that's going to be a wake-up call. But because our media never shares what's going on internationally with other systems of education, Americans have no clue, and they assume that we are still in the forefront. I think it's going to be, well, you mentioned earlier that if you join the Schiller Institute, you will have access to an online magazine, Leonora. By the way, my favorite opera character of all operas. But Richard Black and Lainey Rubenstein have written articles to be published in the next edition of Leonora. And Richard's article is a very practical look at what's going on in Chinese schools now. And Lainey's is a look at classical education and the importance of bringing back that influence to American education. Both of those articles speak thoroughly and very well in terms of what's going on in other countries. Richard's is focused on Russian and Chinese educators taking steps to make sure that their students stay focused on what's important. Nothing like that is going on in American education right now. It needs to. But again, American educators and American citizens are ignorant to what's happening in China that's going to catapult them way ahead of us intellectually. Many Americans still think that the Chinese are stealing our technology and our science and desperately wanting to see what we do so they can copy it. China is so far ahead of that, again, most Americans have no clue. And when they are eventually made aware of that, it's going to be a real eye-opener. I hope it doesn't take that 10 years down the road for Americans to learn from others, as China has been willing to do, and to institute some significant, badly needed reforms in American schools.
That's very clear. Professor Wahab, do you find a similar trend in American education?
Yes, and I think one of the ways to judge and evaluate American education system is to sort of look at American society and life in America. As I said earlier, if you look at American society, our government, our politics, our highways, our bridges, our buildings, our court systems, our neighborhoods, the violence, the polarization, the incivility, the people not knowing their civic responsibility, the lack of ethics, the lack of corruption, the plutocracy, the demise of democracy. All of these are, I think, to me, indicative of a very inadequate education system. Even the best higher education institutions like, the Ivy League institutions and so forth. And I think there are reasons, and the difficulty starts in preschool. Schools, the quality of school teachers, class sizes, a short school day, a short school week, a short school year, the lack of commitment by the government and by the parents. Um, the inequities, the inequalities, the inaccessibility, the lack of democracy, etc. All of these are sort of indices of a failing American education system, which translate directly to the failings of the American society. I mean, it seems like we're becoming, I hate to say this, but a third world country, a banana republic. And obviously, the Chinese education system, the European education system, all of these are much, much better than the American education system. And when you compare, for example, the National Education Assessment of Educational Progress, when they compare, the quality or the performance of school children, we are very low in that hierarchy. We show that American kids lack their basic skills, whether it's math, science, geography, history, foreign languages, knowledge. American students are lacking. When you look at character building or fostering creativity, innovation, problem solving, I'm afraid the American education system is declining, and with it, the decline shows in American society. And soon, I think we're all going to be very sorry for this.
Thank you. Oh, Ola, would you like to say something?
Yes, just a very short remark. I'm very sad to say that in spite of being able to know much better from monitoring what's going on in the United States, Germany is faring just exactly along these coordinates over the last years. I won't get into any details here, but I can say that all the things that have just been described right now are absolutely happening in Germany as well. Plus, I would like to emphasize the problem of lack of understanding of authority. Germans seem to have a very deep problem with reasonable authority that has some historical reasons, but it also totally undermines any consensus about pedagogy, about asking all these vital questions, not in terms of nationalism or in terms of chauvinism or any of that, although such attempts would always be associated with such no-goes in the public realm. But Anyway, there's a huge timidity among the people who know better, who know that guidance is needed, that responsibility is a matter of character, and that this also requires maturity, and all these things that have ultimately led to a situation where we are getting bossed around for very legitimate reasons by young people who are just noisy and premature, but who put their fingers into our mistakes, asking, where is your leadership? What kind of world are you leaving us with? So they are asking these questions, but they don't even dream of the reality that Germany has been the place where Humboldt, Goethe, Schiller, and Kant actually thrived for a long time. So this is a very sad story. But we can, of course, revive this better knowledge, even in Western countries, I hope.
Thank you very much. There's a question that's come in, which I would actually like to address. And then there's a few more, and I think we'll make our closing round. I'll give the questions, and people will have each an opportunity to say something. This is from Cade in Pennsylvania, who writes, with the cynical use of United States school boards as a site for increasing polarization, where can we best organize for a Humboldt style of classical aesthetic education? Jumping into these polarized battles, organizing independent charter style schools, crafting materials and seminars for homeschooling. And I would just say, as I said earlier, one, I think we have to get to people's morality, because as you hear from all of the teachers here, if you have a population that cannot find within their heart the ability to address the fact that we could lose tens of millions of people on this planet due to totally curable ills like starvation, then we are not morally fit to survive. Also, there's the other question of thermonuclear war, which is another moral question. Finally, on the question of education, I understand why, with some of the horrors that are occurring in public schools, where efforts are being made to keep the family out. That's what I was very struck by what Denise Rainey was describing about China, where the parents are very much involved in the educational process. In the United States, there seems to be a trend toward what Bertrand Russell called for, which is get rid of the family so you can manipulate the children. And this seems to be particularly in the case where they are working to convince children that they were actually intended to be another gender than that which they were born with. And the parents are not informed at all, and people are told not to tell them. So from that standpoint, I can understand why people would want to yank their children out of the public schools. But I would also say that if we don't have a decent public educational system, then we are finished, because one person who is well educated and has a great character and morality had better be one heck of an organizer if everyone else is completely insane and illiterate. And therefore, we have no choice but to actually restore a high standard of public education. This is part of the general welfare. We have to have public schools that function. And I know in New York City, and I imagine this is a case in many cities around the country, the schools are treated as public housing. They are allowed to go into decay. The buildings have all kinds of problems. And then you have, of course, the ongoing assault on what's being taught there. But I don't think there is a solution in the private realm in that way if we don't return to a standard of public education, universal education, but probably not through the NEA, I just have to say. So that's my comment. Now, there's a couple more questions, and perhaps people make also their closing remarks. And before I read them, I'd just like to make a couple more announce again. Denise, thank you for talking about joining the Schiller Institute and getting Leonora. People should join the Schiller Institute and get that publication. Also, I would like to say, as Megan DeBroat said earlier, we are publishing the works of Lyndon LaRouche, the greatest genius that the United States has produced thus far, and the LaRouche Legacy Foundation.org has where you can order his first book. I also feel obligated to say something right now, which is that there is an organization known as LaRouche PAC, which does not in any way represent the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. And there is a statement from Helga Zepp-LaRouche to that effect at the LaRoucheOrganization.com and on the Schiller Institute. And if you have any question about why LaRouche PAC does not represent LaRouche, you should refer yourself to those statements. Also, I think it should be obvious from the content that has been presented here thus far. So the questions now that I have not yet gotten to include one from someone in Argentina saying that Jacques has described the manipulation exercised by the intellectually malformed media. Shouldn't we be promoting a Belt and Road initiative for communications? Obviously, it's not enough to be right if nations can be poisoned with lies, including from the entertainment industry. And there's another related question on the censorship from Joe in Texas, who said, I've been told that YouTube tried to ban this beautiful program. By the way, they've since admitted they were completely wrong. Oh, hold on, I'm getting a note. But at any rate, so the question is that what Mr. Cheminade presented in his remarks, could we not call for the shutdown of the internet sponsors of the Squid Game? Could we not have some kind of standards for what is allowed on the social media? I think there used to be standards, but they seem to be thrown out the window. Now the standard is the more gory, violent, and disgusting it is, the more that it's going to be shown. So these are two final questions that have come in. I've also been asked to announce that the full Robert Beltran's comments and statement were edited for time reasons, but the full 9 minutes will be available on the Schiller Institute website following this. So given these things, maybe this will be your final chance to say something on this program. We will go to Jacques Cheminade first.
Well, it's a change in the whole society that is needed. It's not only Squid Games or this or that. It's a change of our way of thinking. I think that from that standpoint, we should address the question of the wake-up call. The wake-up call should be also about our very process of decision-making in the West. In China, you have a problem. It comes from the period of the single child. So if it's a male child, the male child was overprotected by the family. It could have become, in many cases, capricious, yelling, screaming. But there is something else. It's overcome by a sharing of values transmitted both, as it was said before, as a one, by the families and the professors and all the people in schools. So that's a one, and that's a form of society and thinking. This creates a situation where when there is a meeting in China, some people may have this still habit to scream, but all are concerned about how to make better. And in that sense, because they have a reference to a higher principle, they don't consider the little case as such. They are able to consider what went wrong with them, to investigate about their misdoings. And it creates a process of decision which is honest. We spoke about honesty. There is honesty. While in the West, nobody wants to recognize her or his mistakes generally. So people in this process of decision making in China are able to focus on the uplift of the social group. So the social group, as for China, but also seeing as the destiny of humanity, is seeing as a whole, while we in the West, we are divided into a series of more selves. So I think there is a lot to learn, basically, on what is far beyond the issue of video games or else.
Thank you very much. Let us go to Professor Ola During.
Yes. Well, there's so much to be said. First, about China, I'm a little bit nervous if we refer all the great things that are going on without paying attention to the hybrid of Chinese real culture. One factor that is a lot of the tone that is now prevailing in China regarding its national strengthening again has to do with the fact that China is in many ways Americanized, like Europe has been Americanized, but Europe has been Americanized in different ways than China has. And in China, this is for many reasons not public common knowledge. It is not so much expressed, and really think that it is the responsibility of Western countries and scholars to actually formulate as a problem, articulate in terms of an analysis of the problematic situation, to see how wrong things have gone over the last 30 years regarding this influence. And I'm not nationalizing this, the blame on America. Of course, each country is responsible for what we have done here in Germany, responsible very much. But the kind of the pattern that has turning everything into a monoculture for neoliberal gains, I think this was clear here in this conference as well, that most people agree to this assessment. And the second thing, and to end with, is we really should look at the future. And the future, when we take China as an indicator for where we have to look, and the future is Africa, people. We really have to find a way in terms of patronizing, but in terms of really creating a situation of equity and equality, also in our finding a proper way of learning from our experiences, good and bad, and offering perspectives for collaboration. So, because I think the future really lies in the question, what's going to happen with all the young people in Africa who want a future and who will have a future, with or without being friends with us. So I think China and Africa in that way really belong the perspective of global innovation in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. Some of us might say that the United States has also been Britishized, but okay. Professor Zahir Wahab.
Yes, I have one preoccupation and one obsession these days. First, I'm deeply concerned and very troubled by what I see happening in my adopted country, the United States. I came here as a graduate student half a century ago. And when I look back and in the interim, I see this country declining rather precipitously. Its education, its economy, its political system, it's what's called culture, its media, entertainment, values, etc. I'm really, really concerned about, the country and my own place in it. It's very difficult to be comfortable, or feel safe or secure or at ease, whether you're watching the news, quote unquote, or taking a walk in the streets. The violence, the racism, the sexism, the classism, some of the inhumanity that I see to human beings. These are deeply troubling me, and also this country its ruling elite could get us into some very big um, uh, trouble and problems. So I hope that something is done, and maybe we should begin with education. Really, we should make it a top priority as individuals, groups, communities, the nation, and the government. My obsession, though, is really Afghanistan, my country of birth. We all know, and you have observed and pointed out kindly, that this is a country on the brink, and this is man made. And I say man made by the United States and its partners in crime, and with the collusion of the so called Afghan governments over the last 20 years. As you know, most people are right now hungry, they're sick, they're famished, and they could starve. It's getting very cold, and COVID-19 is very severe. The country is experiencing a drought. There's no money. There's no government. There are no schools. There are no doctors. There's no medicine. There's no heating. There's not even enough drinking water. And as I said, this is man-made. There are powers that deliberately produce this situation, and I think they're morally and ethically responsible to fix the situation as quickly as possible and end my obsession. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope also we can do that. Denise, Rainey. Whoops, you're muted there. Hold.
Yes, thank you.
There we go.
So many good points have been made and so much has been said. I don't have any outstanding wisdom to cap this all off with, but my one of my biggest concerns is that Americans are ignorant, and worse than being ignorant, indifferent to what is going on in other parts of the world, not only educationally, but politically, economically, socially. If you go to Europe, it's very easy to end up in a conversation about politics, and Europeans love to talk politics and are generally better informed than Americans are about what's going on around the world. Before I left for China, people were telling me, oh, well, there's no internet there and they don't have access to the web, and you're going to be cut off for the weeks that you're there. That could not have been more untrue. The administrative team and the leadership team of the principal that I was connected with used to inform me every morning about things that were going on in the United States and in the world, and natural crises or some big crime story or whatever was going on in the United States. I was being better informed about it in China than I probably would have been here. My point being that I worry that Americans need to wake up, so to speak, and become more alert about what is going on in other countries. Americans make the assumption that they know what's going on in the world and that people in other countries do not, and that could not be further from the truth. So, of course, it would start with our educational system, and volumes could be written on what needs to be reformed in American education, but it can't be done in isolation. It has to be done as a piece of overall cultural reform. And I think the first step to Americans being cognizant of that and willing to make the change is that they need to become better informed about what's going on elsewhere in the world and less focused on the petty shows that they watch on TV and the petty pursuits that occupy their time. This institute, of course, is a great beginning to that end, but so much more needs to be done because the average American is just happily ignorant about what's going on elsewhere in the world.
Thank you. I would say unhappily ignorant because I think Americans are rather unhappy right now, but they could become happy if they would do something for the good. So I will leave it to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, our president of the Schiller Institute, to wrap up and say whatever she would like us to leave this conference with.
Well, what Denise is saying about Americans not knowing about the rest of the world is an obvious fact to anybody. And in 2000, I made a speech in Washington about the new Silk Road, which we were promoting after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the title of that speech was, and it had a lot of footage about the ancient Silk Road and the modern developments. The title of that speech was "Why Americans Should Go There," actually proposing that more Americans should travel to China, because also with the Europeans, given the massive anti-China campaign, which started really, in earnest 2017, it accelerated. The only people who have a better view are people who are either, who have lived in China, who have traveled there extensively, or are married with a Chinese, or have some other direct knowledge. And I think this is really very, very important, because if people don't see that, and I think what Denise, what you are reporting is extremely valuable, because that is exactly the experience everybody makes who goes there. Now, I understand that not everybody can now make travel plans and go to China, but if people can, they should. I mean, otherwise, I would really urgently point to the fact that, there needs to be a reflection of why the West deteriorated to the point we are at today. And I also agree with Ole Döring that, the situation in Germany and Europe is not very far behind. I want to point to the fact that my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has written a lot of articles. Jacques was mentioning one of them. I mentioned another one yesterday, where he already in the 60s uniquely recognized the paradigm shift which was going on then, where the optimism of the Kennedy period, and when Kennedy's death was 50 years, we had this beautiful Requiem concert in Boston in the cathedral, and we played a couple of the speech excerpts from Kennedy, and people can go to the website and listen to that. It's like a different universe. I mean, Kennedy said things like, there is no limit to the perfectionability of human beings, and many more things like that, about the development of the developing countries, and just a totally different paradigm. And when he was killed, and then the murder was covered up, that was the beginning of the paradigm shift. And then you had the sex, drug, rock counterculture, which my husband uniquely recognized as that which would, in the medium term, destroy the cognitive potential of the population. And he warned again and again to reverse it. So I would encourage people to study how came that Lyndon LaRouche was able to identify that with an absolute scientific precision. And what we see today in terms of all the elements which Professor Wahab correctly describes, is the end result of a degeneration process of the neoliberal paradigm, which has taken the form everything is allowed, everything goes. And this is one of the reasons why the West was absolutely incapable of dealing with the COVID pandemic. I mean, in Germany, you have right now a complete explosion of the fourth wave. You have in some European countries indication, numbers going through this 1,000 mark, which is really alarming. The United States also has not been able, despite the vaccines, to really get it under control. And this is because people do put this extreme, exaggerated individualism above the common good. And, once people believe that they have the right to do everything and they have no obligation to make the community, the country, the nation work, then they don't take any advice, not from doctors nor anybody else. And these are all symptoms of the same, the collapse in education, the brutality in the entertainment media, the lack of civility, which a lot of people have observed. That is all the end result of that paradigm shift of neoliberal values, the rock, drugs, sex, counterculture, and all its aspects of it. And unless, and my husband said many times, he said, unless we correct that and replace that paradigm with a true renaissance of classical culture, which puts an image of man again up front, where, as Beltran was saying, that every human being is in the image of the creator. And you don't have to look at that religiously if you don't want, but that there is such a deeper ontological connection between the image of man and the conception of the universe. Hinduism, for example, is absolutely clear that there is a cosmic order which affects the way people behave. And Nicholas of Cusa basically talks about the microcosm and the macrocosm being governed by the same lawfulness. And you find the same idea in almost every culture, that there is such a connection between the image of man and the identity of man, and the way how he relates to the physical universe at large. And I think we have to have a return to these metaphysical, ontological groundings of the image of man, and basically go back to the idea of natural law, go back to the idea of humanism, go back to the idea of the beauty in culture as that which makes culture. Schiller said, a piece of art which is not beautiful is not a piece of art. So there are many aspects about this whole question, but I think we need a classical renaissance, because if people again would have the idea that their aim is to self-perfect themselves in their life so that they can be of a better service to the country as a whole, or humanity as a whole, then this would stop. This is what the Chinese are doing. They try to make things better because they think that that's right. In the West, nobody tries to make things better. People want to have more money. They want to have more this. We need this paradigm shift. And I think, since we also are in the emergency, we discussed about Afghanistan. I mean, I think that is in Haiti. I could say Yemen and but I want to say Afghanistan and Haiti are the two places where that paradigm shift must become a deed and not just a word. So I would invite all of you to join with us. We have these initiatives, the Committee for Coincidence of Opposites. I really would love to get this Operation Ibn Sina going, because I think we can move mountains once a lot of people join together for a good plan.
Thank you. So I would like to thank everybody who participated in this last panel of our very important conference. All the moral resources of humanity have to be called up. Mankind must be an immortal species. And I would encourage everyone who watched to make sure to catch all of the panels that you missed, if this is what you're seeing so far. And I hope we'll be together again soon, and one day, hopefully in person. So thank you very much. And thank you, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, for your work.
And thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you.